Ok ragazzi, è arrivato il momento. Sapete che ogni tanto guardiamo dei documentari, no? Ok? E ne è uscito uno un po' di giorni fa da uno dei canali di documentari più famosi che ci siano, che è NoClip. D'accordo? E guardate un po', il caso, il documentario è su Soul Reaver. Ok? E si chiama The Past, Present and Future of Soul Reaver. E cioè il passato, il presente e il futuro di Soul Reaver. Dura un'oretta, quindi sì, direi che è il momento di guardarlo. Il documentario, al solito, cuffiamoci, mutiamo la musica di sottofondo. Ecco qua, aperto l'audio. Allora, per quanto riguarda, ovviamente in inglese, ma per quanto riguarda i sottotitoli, ci sono i sottotitoli in inglese seri, cioè quelli fatti bene, che sono tradotti in italiano, quindi dovrebbero essere un po' meglio, ok? Della media. Ok, bene. Quindi, ragazzi, documentario di NoClip su Soul Reaver. Si va. Pronti? Ah, ok. Allora, prima di fare qualunque cosa, ragazzi, sì, quando ci sono queste cose, ovviamente facciamo dei reaction a dei video lunghi, dei documentari particolari. Questo è il canale di NoClip, ok? Andate subito a iscrivervi perché è un canale bellissimo, si merita assolutamente l'iscrizione e se volete supportarli in altre maniere vi consiglio di farlo perché è un canale veramente figo che fa delle gran belle cose. Quindi noi che ci limitiamo a fare la reaction e parlare di questo documentario, almeno cerchiamo di supportare il canale in sé. D'accordo ragazzi? Quindi torniamo al documentario.
And then my last question, of all the old Kristal games, what is the one people ask for you to go back to more than any?
Legacy of Kain, hands down. It's like, it's a setup. You know it's a setup. It certainly is. Like, even when we announced the Embracer deal and we talked about the IP that come with us, they're like, oh, Legacy of Kain.
Se la volete in 16 nonni, ragazzi, dovete venire su Twitch.
Calm, we're focused over here. But LOK top down is the one that people ask for the most.
All right. We ain't seen nothing yet.
Ain't seen nothing yet.
So, we can all appreciate that there's no shortage of reboots, remasters, re-releases, and remakes of beloved video game franchises. God knows NoClip has covered enough of these over the years. But when you look back at the past 2 decades of practically every classic game getting a facelift of some description or another, there's one particular holdout which has continued to puzzle fans.
Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver came out in 1999 and almost immediately made a name for itself. Its impressive late PS1 3D rendering, coupled with a world and narrative that seemed self-serious but entirely believable, made it stand out in a generation with no shortage of classics. Like many franchises, it struggled to reach that high watermark again, but while so many other games, both grander and lesser, made their triumphant returns, it seemed Raziel and Kain were destined to sleep for eternity.
Over the years, the Soul Reaver community has only become more steadfast in their desire for a return
sì, è una saga preferita di
and given Kristal Dynamics' radio silence over the past 2 decades, have taken it upon themselves to be keepers of the flame.
A global community of strangers who shared lore, made art, cosplayed, data mined lost content, and released patches to keep the games playable in an era where Kristal Dynamics had other things on their mind. Their faith was rewarded when earlier this year Kristal Dynamics announced that they were set to release a remaster of Soul Reaver 1 and 2.
Che è uscita pochi giorni fa.
Not quite the reboot so many fans have been praying for, but a glimmer of light after decades of darkness.
We will talk about that project at some stage in this video and its important part in this story, but this tale is about so much more than Soul Reaver's past. It's about its future too.
The question on everyone's lips is, what's it going to take to bring back Soul Reaver? And in this documentary, we're going to attempt to uncover the future of the franchise by dissecting its 25-year legacy.
Secondo me,
the past year, we've taken our time to understand this story.
Ci vuole un gioco moderno se vuoi provare a
to vocal supporters
portarlo in auge di nuovo davvero.
Legacy, and to members of the fan community about their work to keep the flame burning. We gained unprecedented access to an archive of lost media that Kristal Dynamics have recently digitized, and we talked to employees at the studio about their hopes for the remaster and their dreams for the future of this franchise.
The question we gotta answer today is, what's it gonna take for Kristal Dynamics to dive two-footed into a new, big-budget AAA Soul Reaver game? And what can the past 25 years tell us about the challenges that face such an effort? Now, we've spent a long time on this talking to a lot of people, and it's gonna take a while before all the different perspectives sort of show you the big picture we're talking about here. But before we get to any of that, let's start the only place we can. 2 of the best games ever released on the PlayStation.
Giusto proprio un pochetto così, eh? Capitolo 1, gli originali.
When I came to Kristal, they had just shifted the game from Shifter to Soul Reaver. Shifter was a game where you were a fallen angel and you could inhabit the bodies of various people. You possess them and basically shift through different realms. So the idea was to shift bodies, shift realms, and to kind of jump around using those two mechanics to sort of solve puzzles and do combat and those kinds of things. When it shifted to the Legacy of Kain franchise, they took the idea of shifting worlds along with it, having the spectral realm and having the material realm, but dropped the idea of possession. I think we tried to keep it, but we found you're basically carrying all of the animation and all of the memory for a main character for all the characters you could possess. So I was given a lot of really cool concept duties, a lot of really cool abilities to work on the textures, which was great. I got to do Kain, I got to do all kinds of creatures, I got to do a bunch of bosses. I met Amy, of course, Amy Hennig, we're really good friends. Talking to her, I was really fascinated with her depth of knowledge about things literary.
Amy Hennig, okay.
Her understanding of like what a Gnostic hero was, you know, she understood the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, she understood, you know, Madman and a lot of different really offbeat comics. And it was really cool to learn from her. And how we incorporated all those elements to create Raziel was really a lot of fun.
Just as a side note too, where I put laugh softly, you know the little patented Simon chuckle that he does? Kind of the little, he did it over and over for Kain last time. Instead of kind of just a little breath of a laugh, when he kind of goes,
Oh, you want to hear?
A little bit of a chuckle, yeah. Real subtle though, it shouldn't be maniacal by any means of course.
I started at Kristal in May of 1998, and it was 2 weeks, I think, or so before they were going to show Soul Reaver 1 at E3. There's about 30-ish people, I think, on the team overall. You know, it seemed like it was busy all the time that I was there because it was, you know, I started in the crunch of finishing E3 builds, and then it was just kind of never really a dull moment. But the game itself was, you know, it was very recognizable as what it sort of, as it shipped. So it wasn't like it was a super early state, but there was still a lot of work that needed to be done too. You know, one of the first things that I worked on after I came there was like the collision.
Bella domanda, non so il nuovo gioco
the spectral realm,
dove si piazzerebbe.
Morphing and things like that.
Se un remake
it was sort of in place,
un
but
seguito
not
vero e
really
proprio.
shippable. The streaming system was pretty cutting edge for the time. The lead programmer, Karl Steika, had worked a lot on that to get that in place so that the game was, you know, could be the basically one contiguous game without any load screens for the most part. We had, as I recall, sort of the mesh and collision data and the color data for the vertices was all stored multiple, you know, twice at least for the regular world and the spectral realm. And you know, there's all sorts of fun problems, like when you would morph into the spectral realm and some wall would shift into the players where the player was to keep them from not going through the world and falling out and other objects and stuff, sort of figuring out what they were supposed to do as the world completely morphed and changed.
Domani
it was
forse,
kind of
ma boh.
End of the PlayStation era title where we were kind of all the, you know, tips and tricks that people had figured out over time were kind of put into play.
We knew we didn't have a ton of polygons to play with in a given area, but we could ignite people's imaginations to think that there was more out there, to hint at a greater world.
You know, at the very end, we were scraping for 10K of memory to be able to ship the game and make it run. There was also a lot of the content kind of figuring out.
10K.
As people know, it didn't have everything that was originally envisioned for the whole game. It got split up more into the other games.
Meritava un remake,
you know,
ma
friends with Amy.
probabilmente non si sono fidati. Hanno preferito andare sul sicuro, lavorare con delle remaster, budget decisamente inferiore, e vedere come va.
All the coders that I worked with, Karl Steika was the lead programmer who was one of the people who primarily figured out the streaming system. Jason Bell, Hong Park was an AI programmer that worked on the project. And it was just, you know, it was a really small, tightly knit team of people. You know, there was a lot of work, it was hard work, we crunched for sure. It was all pretty young people. I mean, the gaming industry has kind of grown up along with the consoles. So at that time, it was a lot of people kind of my age in their early 20s, you know. It was a new, young industry, and so there's kind of a college atmosphere almost to a certain extent. I think, luckily, in the industry, we've improved on that.
Ricordate che sono sempre 25 anni fa,
is a big aspect of things, but you know, in those days, that was just kind of how it was.
Ecco,
Ooh,
esatto.
Yeah, so for the last year of development, we were all in crunch. It was 6 days a week, 12-hour days. By the time we were done, I had no idea what a weekend was or what to do with my time. But it was the kind of thing where it was a labor of love. And so I didn't really notice the time as much. And there was definitely a lot of tension between producers and designers and artists and creatives, because we're trying to make something really special, but at the same time we're getting pressure like, hey, wrap it up, get it done. And so that's why at the end we just ran out of time, and we just said, okay, to be continued, because we just need more time for this. And we want to wrap it up in a good way. And if you saw the original ending of Soul Reaver, it was very different than what you got. But at the same time, it allowed us to continue the franchise, which was great. When we were working on Soul Reaver, especially Soul Reaver 2, it was sort of, let's take the original Blood Omen, and if that's the TV version, for example, let's make the movie version. Let's make everything just plus up as much as we could. And so we tried to take all of the somewhat dated designs and basically plus them up a lot more for PlayStation 2.
The biggest issue at the time was it was sort of the end of the PlayStation 1 era and the PlayStation 2 coming out, and they weren't quite sure what to ship it on. And we were excited when finally we got the go-ahead that could be on the PlayStation 2. When we made the announcements, one of the artists was so excited he was just running around the office shouting, "More polygons, more polygons!" Well, it had more co-processing that you had to deal with to get the full power out of it. And we moved from integer to floating point, math for everything, which was a surprisingly large amount of work to convert over for. With the better texture resolution and mesh and stuff, the cinematics, seeing Amy's stuff come to life was always fun. Certainly now when you look at the difference between PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 and the quality of the images, it felt like you were getting more across of what you intended out of things, and that was exciting.
The themes of Soul Reaver they resonate a lot with people. We've all been destroyed at some point, and we all had to pick ourselves up and put ourselves back together again. I think people misunderstand sometimes that they think Soul Reaver is a rock and roll kind of game where like, hey, you kill vampires, you're a monster, da da da. But to me, it's more gothic. And by gothic, I mean that it takes pain and turns it into beauty. At the time, there was nothing like it. And when I was working on it, I was into a lot of different things. I was into Dungeons and Dragons. I was into the different Japanese models and creatures of the time. Anime wasn't quite as big as it is now. So
l'edizione fisica della remastered non so
anime,
niente.
especially Go in the Guys, Devilman and things like that. Things that were pretty vicious and destructive, and Vampire Hunter D.
Vero.
And I had taken all those things that I love and poured it into this game for our design aesthetic. Kind of throwing it out there and assuming an intelligence, an artistic intelligence, an emotional intelligence, a literary intelligence to the player, that they would get it. And the people that did get it would really be into it, because that's what I was into when I was a kid too. I wished that I had a game like this.
I mean, I think it's a game that lends itself to passionate fans because it has that sort of interesting world, the mythology that was created behind it, the world building, the characters, the great writing that Amy did on the Soul Reaver games, the story, the complexity of it, the twists and turns, lends it something that I think people would can dig a little bit deeper into than a straightforward just kind of regular action game.
L'unico approccio con Soul Reaver fu una
Soul
vecchia
Reaver
demo
1 and Soul
PS1.
Reaver 2 were near perfect
in realtà per
marriages
tanti,
of
per il
artistic
design è
depth
rimasto
and
impresso a
technical
tanti, sì,
breakthroughs,
esatto.
something that many classics of that early PlayStation 1 era can thank their legacies for.
But before we explore that legacy and what it means to fans and the world of gaming today, let's take a step back and look at the wider series as a whole. Because of course there were games both before and after Soul Reaver 1 and 2. The first game in the series was Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, a top-down vampire RPG published by Crystal Dynamics but developed by Canadian studio Silicon Knights. In 1999, the franchise was brought in-house and we got its sequel, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, a 3D platformer where you played as an entirely different character called Raziel. In 2001 came Soul Reaver 2, a sequel to that game. 2002 saw a 3D sequel to the original Blood Omen game called Blood Omen 2. And in 2003, Legacy of Kain Defiance was a game where you played as both Kain and Raziel. These last two games are decent, but less beloved than the original three. Over the years, there have been a few cancelled sequels too. Legacy of Kain The Dark Prophecy, headed by Ritual, Legacy of Kain Dead Sons, headed by Climax, and Nosgoth, a free-to-play multiplayer action game developed by Psyonix, who would later go on to make Rocket League. This ran in open beta for just over a year
questa non la
before being
sapevo.
cancelled due to lack of interest.
Soul Reaver came out 25 years ago in 1999, but the fifth and most recent game in the franchise, Legacy of Kain Defiance, came out in 2003.
No, la serie no, ragazzi.
So how is it there are still so many fans of these games when the most recent version of it came out 21 years ago?
Capitolo 2, The Legacy sarà il retaggio? Sì. In questo caso.
Back in the olden days, before I worked on games directly, I was a video games journalist for print magazines initially. Even from my POV, Kristal was, for me, Gex, Tomb Raider, and Legacy of Kain. That's, you know, if you think about Nintendo and you think about Mario, or you think about Sega, you think about Sonic. It was at this weird tipping point for the games industry where we were going from cartridges with sort of obviously limited memory, but also limited scope on what kind of game you could put in the box. And we were getting into what we used to call multimedia, where it was CD-ROM games, and it just really opened up, especially storytelling. So Blood Omen for me, apart from being just a sort of generally attractive genre, it was a sort of action game with RPG pretensions, but set in this like cool gothic vampire universe. It was about atmosphere and storytelling initially. The sequel, the Soul Reaver sequels, really radically changed what the game was about. And ironically, they made it much more about sort of third-person action, exploration, traversal is what they call climbing and jumping nowadays. But it did it with the same sort of storytelling ethos, which was just to tell a big, dark, grown-up story with philosophy, genuinely compelling characters, a genre.
E questo funzionerebbe tanto anche al giorno d'oggi, secondo me.
I didn't know about Blood Omen when I played Soul Reaver. I didn't know about the story of Kain, so for me, Kain was the villain. Kain wasn't the hero.
Lui?
I didn't come into this knowing,
mi sembrava di,
you know, what had happened before and the
sembrava di riconoscerlo prima.
And it was just like, this guy looks really mean. He looked like a I was trying to think what he looked like.
Looks like a baddie.
Yeah, he just looked like a baddie. No, he looks like Ivan Ooze from the Power Rangers movie. It's what he looks like.
No, cosa?
He just looks really kind of devilish. And Raziel is just a badass. He's just an absolute badass. Essentially what we were seeing.
Lamperena Junior, grazie mille dei follow, ragazzi.
Years, basically just having his body torn apart. And afterwards he picks himself up, finds a sash, he's like, yeah, cool, I look cool now. There's this kind of like otherworldly knowledge that Kain seems to have above everything else. And then you've got Mobius and these powers that are greater than him. And what does the Elder God actually truly want? And is it this parasite that's actually eating at the heart of Nosgoth? Just these kind of huge, incomprehensible images that make Raziel seems so cool and so helpless at the same time. And I think that's why he's both a badass and kind of pathetic in a way, that makes him one of these characters that I think still stands up as one of the great all-time video game characters. Yeah, it's a good game. It's a good game. They're good games. They're just good games.
Some people would say, oh, that's a really great story. And sometimes, well, maybe it's not the story that's great. Maybe it's the storytelling. I remember Half-Life 2, which is one of my favorites. It's not a really complicated story, but the storytelling is so great. I think what was neat about Legacy of Kain, not only was the story very rich, Soul Reaver did such a great job at its storytelling as well.
Acting in games, performance in games, you look back on that kind of PS1 era and it wasn't great, but this was. And I do think that the opening to Soul Reaver is probably still one of the greatest video game openings of all time. I still go back and watch that opening regularly, and I can't believe how well the whole thing just stands up. Yeah,
era il mio idolo finché l'ho sottolineato per volte 25 anni fa, un quarto di secolo. Accettare il boomerismo è parte di tutti noi. Va bene.
The descent had destroyed me, and yet I lived.
Ciao Kuro.
It makes perfect sense to cite Tomb Raider as the kind of predecessor to it from a gameplay framework standpoint because it's Crystal Dynamics. But what you are doing is going through these kind of rudimentary 3D spaces, looking around you and looking at the objects in this space, figuring out how to progress forward. And usually it's some mixture of moving blocks or pushing architecture.
Lo spostamento dei blocchi è proprio Tomb Raider di Crystal Dynamics, i primi due Tomb Raider, assolutamente.
Raziel's ability to transition between the spectral and the material realm. So it's kind of a quite an advanced gameplay design set of systems, but that's the kind of core chunk of it. It's traversal and platforming. However, there's also combat in between there, and there's just almost like this awkward dance where you're kind of strafing around the enemies and finding the right moment to like lunge at them.
Yuke, grazie mille del follow,
the
benvenuto.
gameplay loop, as it's known these days, isn't as streamlined and as slick as it is these days, but it still has enough of a connective tissue to make it quite absorbing and like engrossing.
Yeah, it was a good game at the time for what it was doing, but it had this sort of like heavyweight punch of kind of deep lore that the writer had created for the, or you know, the designers had created for the game. A really solid script, like top-notch voice acting. You're kind of like, wait, what? They did all this for this, you know, sort of game, the action game that I'm playing? Like, this is awesome. I think at the time the only other games that had that kind of depth were like,
per questo dico che c'è altro
real deep,
da fare riguardo a questo gioco.
Like, world-class voice acting or anything. And then Soul Reaver, there was a technical achievement of you know, morphing these worlds. I mean, that's on that console. That was
sempre 25 anni fa. Però è una di quelle cose che ho detto, questa formula secondo me, provate a pensarlo
back then we were a little bit more isolated from
in Unreal 5.
You know, it was you know, Metacritic and things like that were it was harder to understand the collective, like, how popular is a game or is it not? So it's just kind of like, it seemed like it did well and we liked working on it, so it was again another logical thing to work on next, and there was more story to tell. I do remember we started to play around, you know, we added playable cane, the camera system was somewhat different, and that was on purpose to kind of try some new things, to spice things up a little. There was other games at the time that influenced us to try that kind of stuff. Blood Omen 2 was a separate team, kind of separate engine that they were trying to get going, which we eventually did take a lot of the aspects of that engine and combine it when we switched to doing Tomb Raider.
I think over time, the legacy has only kind of been enriched by other people sharing the stories of how it affected them. Each game reinforced why the previous one was great.
Credo che oggi lo farebbero open world all'ombra di Mordor. Oddio, potrebbe essere. Però in realtà, che se dovessero mantenere una struttura simile, secondo me non è sbagliato.
Yeah, it was like the feeling of like watching Lost or Dark or just someone who is so much more intelligent than you is peeling back the layers of this story and revealing something. Whether they had the grand plan to begin with, I don't know, but it felt like they did, and I felt like I was being made to feel really clever.
Why do you think we haven't seen one successfully released in those 21 years?
I mean, I think we haven't seen one for a lot of reasons, and it's hard to pin it down to a specific thing. I think it's a lot of like, there was a point where these kind of games, they became almost oversaturated, primarily also because post Soul Reaver, it was diminishing returns, in that I personally feel like there was some mishandling of that franchise, with obviously multiple teams had different ideas of what it should be, and then, you know, Soul Reaver existed at the same time as Blood Omen, and Kane and Raziel were happening at the same time, and there was like this divergence, convergence, and it became very messy. And I think the lack of direction and the lack of vision for the IP as a whole is what led it to becoming this thing where it felt like it's too complicated. Let's just chuck it in a vault and move on, because Lara is way more important. We should move on to other ideas and that kind of stuff.
The reality is, and
invece maledizione
knows this, sometimes you
vale la
come
pena
up with the
secondo me.
best idea ever, and then the business case just no longer makes sense.
Something that's obviously thought about a lot, but it's tricky to get things off the ground too for a franchise that's fairly old now in some ways. There's been a big break between games, and that you can come back strong from that, and sometimes you don't. But I'm hopeful that we'll see a new game in the future.
Tanta roba, finito oggi il primo, si vede che è invecchiato ma è ancora buono. Sì, dicendo a mio gusto un po' troppo, nel senso non mi va più di rigiocare i titoli di quell'epoca lì, però sì, ha molto da dare. Capitolo 3 è la community, ok. Il fatto è che c'è dietro tanta community. Mo vediamo com'è andato questo qui, cioè la vendita di queste remastered. Però le remastered sono per i nostalgici. Te bisogna avere per guardare i tuoi video? Beh, mi viene da dire non essere un idiota, indipendentemente dall'età. Però non faccio contenuti per bambini, ecco.
Effectively the sort of de facto leader of that community, old school fan who loved the game, loved the series, knew an encyclopedic amount about it, but was kind of a collaborator and cooperator with the rest of the community.
I think I was one of the very few in school who actually was playing games, and obviously being a girl, it was just so like, oh my god, my sister is not into this at all, so I'm the black sheep, you can kind of say, because our country was Czechoslovakia when I was born, so we had to, these Vietnamese imports and clones of real consoles, because Nintendo wasn't even shipping real consoles until much later in the 90s, so you were all relying on these 999 games in one cartridges kind of thing. I think it was after the split up, like post 95, when they finally started shipping, PlayStation consoles and Nintendo and stuff. When I actually could start buying original games, it was like a godsend. I mean, they're expensive, don't get me wrong. But I saved up, put away birthday money. I took them all back from home from Slovakia to here, so I have a nice display case with them. When I saw the cover or the review for Soul Reaver, it's just the striking pose of Raziel, something unseen. Is he a zombie? Is he a vampire? What is he? He has this really cool look to him. And even as a little kid, I was like, wow, I'm so into it. And I just, love to climb to the lighthouse in the demo, just glide off to the bottom and then come back up, and just those sound effects, very crunchy, very satisfying when he flips his wings open. It was just so amazing back in PS1 graphics. I mean, to us it was awesome.
Sì, all'epoca lo era davvero, me lo ricordo bene.
Fun, like the alpha builds from January, February, and you can see the state of them. Like, while they're playable, there are lots of issues, and it crashes, and it doesn't have this and that. For the game, and even in the May build, like, even though it's better, it's just constantly crashing. But yeah, the game was constantly just freezing and stuff like that. In May, literally like 2-3 months before release, so they somehow pull it together, and then obviously they had to do really hard work to make it happen.
Over the years, these early builds became the foundation of a new pillar within the Soul Reaver community, data mining early versions of the games to access cut content, looking through code and file structures to try and puzzle out elements of the game that were lost to time. For one fan who loved the puzzles and lore of this world, and who was starved for new Soul Reaver content, uncovering these lost levels became a sort of metagame, an obsession while he waited for a new Soul Reaver title, a new way to uncover the secrets of the Soul Reaver universe.
In the beginning, it was just the bits that they'd left in the data files that were unused. So voice clips and models and so forth. In those days, so in the early 2000s, there was one community che fa queste cose, a beta version of Soul Reaver that was pretty close to the final version in terms of the areas. Didn't have the major deleted areas, for example. But we did a lot of looking at that, trying to piece things out. And then in 2018 or 19, we finally got a hold of very early prototypes of Soul Reaver and Blood Omen as well. And then since then a few more have escaped, and it's certainly been interesting to look at those. It really does feel like a puzzle, and I really enjoyed it. I do that sort of thing professionally now, and so I probably wouldn't be where I am today if I had not played Soul Reaver back in the olden days. When those alpha builds of Soul Reaver escaped, we were able to look at the code for things like the possession ability that was removed from the game, and we could really see how that worked. How's it interacting with the game engine itself? Where you're supposed to trigger it in the game is not hooked up. But if I just flip this bit over here because I've looked at the code and figured out where that is, I can set the game into a state where you're controlling one of the other creatures.
You know, for a PlayStation, you spend all your polygons on the main character. And so you don't want to spend that on every single character. You can't do it. It's just not going to work. So because the camera is closer to your main character and because you see the main character all the time, you spend all your polygons on it when you can. And that simply wasn't going to work for a possession type game. So we basically switched to just having one character, and that was Raziel.
The more that comes out, the more the sort of fans of that material and I have been surprised about just how close they got to finishing it. And when we saw, oh wow, you know, the smokestack is basically there. Tyrell is there. The whole thing is laid out. It's just that the puzzles don't work yet. And you know, similar situation with the Undercity. It really felt like, you know, wow, they spent another 4 or 5 months removing it and then polishing up what was left. Was that not enough time? And, you know, so we're curious about, there's probably a technical limitation of the PlayStation hardware or something like that.
Room size was definitely one idea. We had an Undercity that was just too big. We tried to make it cavernous, and literally you could only see one side of the room as you turned around. You could see one side on the left and one side on the right, but you couldn't see the whole thing as it was because it just simply wouldn't load at the same time. The graphics couldn't take it.
It's a miracle, I think, in the end, and also giving the PS1 limitations, like, you know, the graphics, the memory, like it had 2 megabyte video memory. It's like seems so little. Like, how did they? You have to kind of consider it. You can't just compare it to current state. You know, at the time it was a technical marvel, and I'll still always say it. Graphically, technologically, obviously, story was great.
Assolutamente
gameplay.
sì.
To me, it's my favorite game of all time. Still, after 25 years, nothing tops that.
So what about those cancelled games? The Soul Reaver community has put a lot of work into trying to establish which games were cancelled and which were just prototypes or ideas that never made it past the pitch phase. Perhaps if we can get a better understanding of why these games never materialized, we can get a better understanding of the difficulty this franchise suffers in trying to come back.
The Dark Prophecy is the first one that we discovered. That one, as I understand it, was sort of outsourced to another studio. It had the look of the series from what we've seen from screenshots, but there was some kind of disagreement over the story, which seems to be a common theme in all of the sequels that were never released. Dead Sun, the game that Nosgoth was sort of split off from, has some polarizing opinions in the fan base, but you know, it looks like they made a very nice looking game, and I think their hearts were in the right place. I think those are the two that I know for sure have been disclosed publicly. There have been a lot of rumors and other information over the years about more, but I know I can talk about those two without getting in trouble.
I segreti. Capitolo 4, l'archivio.
When we filmed our Crystal Dynamics documentary in 2022, the studio allowed us to film footage of a physical archive of development materials that folks at the studio had chaperoned through time. In it, there were design documents, scripts, and concept art from dozens
Tanto è
of
qualche
Crystal
persona che chiede
Dynamics
permessi di rimasterizzare
games.
vecchi giochi, non capisco perché l'azienda non concede permesso.
Physical media, videotapes, audio
È
tapes,
per
even
paura
film
delle
reel.
possibili
It's wonderful that this
conseguenze
stuff had been saved,
indesiderate,
but like so many
diciamo così,
archives, the expense
secondo me.
and time-consuming process of digitizing had not happened. Well, that was until recently.
In some ways, we've completed the hardest part, but we're sort of in the middle of a process of de-archiving material. We're lucky. A lot of studios, even with beloved IPs, make the game, ship it, put the stuff in a box, and either lose track of it or throw it out. We're lucky in a sense that somebody over the years kept a pretty decent archive of physical stuff. We've got old comic books and binders full of story bible and script material, but also digital stuff. And when I say that we're finished with the hardest part, it was the de-archiving of the digital collection. And I know that you have literally seen some of this yourself. Boxes and boxes of physical media that had to be digitized, and that was not labeled. So literally hundreds of CDs with, you know, Sharpie, if you're lucky, saying CD1. So working with an archive company, the folks here at Kristal Dynamics in San Mateo went through and digitized every single piece of portable digital media that they could find, and that was CDs, DVDs, iOmega zip drives, if you're old enough to remember those, and floppy disks in 1 or 2 cases.
No, non mi ricordo se l'ho mai visti. Cioè, se li ho mai usati, non credo.
To match them to takes the actors and outtakes the actors were doing to try and make sense of the chronology of it. But as it turned out, it was kind of a treasure chest of stuff. We're looking at ways to make that video more available. You might see some of that in this documentary, in fact. Firstly, discover what it is that we're sitting on top of, and then secondly, making sure that the fans get to see it. There's no point hoarding all this stuff and keeping it secret. So in finding it, like, we had an obligation to crack it open, and it's been a long, expensive process, but I think it's well worth it. We've already found
ai primi Killzone Sony non sembra interessata.
Here's a big crate. It's got one sticker on it that says LOK, so I think that's what we're looking for here. Okay, this is mostly tapes, beta SP tapes. There's a piece of paper here that has just a file structure on it with tick boxes. I think this is probably the digital stuff that we're gonna get a copy of. It's all in 720, it looks like. 60 frames, so I guess that's how they captured it. Voiceover, it looks like. SR2 VO5. So there's Soul Reaver 2. There's a lot of them. Pickups. LOKD, so that's Legacy of Kain Defiance, presumably. BO2 commercial piercing. They did have some really crazy ads for Soul Reaver, so I wonder if some of the stuff is in here.
At a time like this, blood, always blood. Find your dark side. Blood Omen 2 by Eidos Interactive, rated mature.
Kain PC, startup and credits. Soul Reaver 1 Extra, Soul Reaver 2 VO Sessions. Kain Cinematics from the Sony, it says. Soul Reaver 2 Trailer 1 long version NTSC. Soul Reaver 2 Trailer 2. Man, there's so much stuff here. DAT tapes. I haven't seen a DAT tape in forever. Look at these little things. It's like an audio format.
Remake di Medieval
Male
2.
Generic Vampire Hunter.
Qualcuno si ricorda come è andato il remake del primo Medieval?
I wonder how useful any of this would be.
Quello è stato il gioco che mi ha fatto capire che certe volte uno ha un'idea un po'.
But then also, do you spend all the time to go through all of these and find the original lines they use? Like, probably not, right?
Sbagliata in senso buono, come eccessivamente angelica di certi giochi. Legnoso come la merda, madonna.
Well, I can give you those again.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Soul Reaver auditions. Wow. I wonder who they auditioned.
Okay, we need to talk about this.
So there are over 30 hours of DAT tapes in this archive, and I spent months going through them, trying to find choice cuts, let's say. A lot of them are just the recordings of the various Soul Reaver games voiceover sessions. But like I said, some of these were auditions, and Soul Reaver being a game that was made in California, it probably won't surprise you that they auditioned dozens of people for all of these Soul Reaver games. Practically every person I'd ever heard of in the world of voice acting has an audition for one of these games.
The auditions for the Soul Reaver games have some incredible names in there, like Maurice LaMarche from Pinky and the Brain, Richard McGonigal, who plays Sully in Uncharted, Katsushi, aka Phil and Lil from Rugrats, auditioned for Uma in Blood Omen 2. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, even did a few versions of Faustus for Blood Omen 2.
Well, well, our Lord was correct. You are alive. Do you remember me, Kain, who served you so well?
If voice actors don't tickle your fancy, then how about characters from the stars, both Wars and Trek?
Mark Hamill as Janos.
You must delve further back into history, Kain, to know the truth of our heritage.
No,
long ago and long before I first walked the earth, vampires were godlike, and our kind ruled the land.
Robert Picardo as Mobius.
Raziel. Redeemer and Destroyer. Pawn and Messiah.
But don't worry, that is not the craziest thing that I found on these tapes.
When you think of late 90s PlayStation 1 games with iconic voice acting, what games do you think of? Well, one game in particular came out 12 months before Soul Reaver and had a murderer's row of incredible English voice actors who were more than willing to audition for this creepy vampire game.
So let's, for a second, just imagine an alternative universe where these Soul Reaver games are voiced by the cast of Metal Gear Solid.
David Hayter, Raziel.
No, vabbè.
Cain is deified. The clans tell tales of him. Few know the truth. I am Raziel, firstborn of his lieutenants.
This is Ariel, Jennifer Hale.
Your madness has shattered our dreams and blinded you. There is nothing left of me to fear, vampire.
No, Cain. Once more, you underestimate me.
Bellissimo.
The dark gifts manifest differently in each of us.
Cain is deified. The clans tell tales of him. Few know the
Mio
truth.
Dio, mi fanno veramente tornare in mente.
I know you, Raziel. You are worthy.
Would you have liked to have lived in the David Hayter version of Soul Reaver reality?
Vorrei.
I'm very, very glad that I live in the Michael Bell. I'm one of those
No,
people
per carità,
who
però
I cannot think of anything more perfect than those two voice actors being Raziel and Cain.
Mobius trawls for the ignorant and unwary, hauling his gasping prey from the streams of their destinies. Stay out of his net, Raziel.
Spare me your elaborate metaphors, Cain. I have pursued you here for one purpose. You will pay for your betrayal, and balance will thus be restored to Nosgoth.
And whose will is satisfied then? The will of Mobius or Raziel?
Would I be better manipulated by you, Cain? Now, turn and face me. The chase is over.
Those voice actors were, I think, pitch perfect, incredible. The artistry and the craft around video games in every single aspect, including the way that they're performed.
Lies, Raziel. Do not be deceived.
My ancient benefactor. And I dared to hope we had parted ways forever. Your silence was refreshing while it lasted. No doubt you have a conveniently inexpressible reason for your presence here.
Do not be insolent, Raziel. I am eternally present, here and everywhere, now and always. I am the still center of the turning wheel, the hub of this world's destiny.
Già. Oh,
Earlier this year, Crystal Dynamics announced that they were working with Aspire on a remaster of the first
il
two
documentario
Soul Reaver
pochi
games,
giorni.
Aspire themselves coming hot off
Però
the
vabbè, è
heels
stato fatto
of
prima
a
delle remaster.
well-received remaster of the first 3 Tomb Raider titles.
But one interesting thing that connects both of these projects is that to properly modernize these games, Aspire didn't just reach out to the fan communities for advice or help, they actually employed them to do the work.
When we first started talking to Aspire about a remaster, they had a similar conversation about Tomb Raiders. Which ones are the right ones?
No, il gioco originale è di 25 anni fa. La remaster è uscita pochi giorni fa praticamente. Cioè pochi, vabbè, settimanelle.
Soul Reaver 1 and 2 tend to be the ones that people's memories just first jump back to, so it was an easy starting point. I think you get the most value for money out of remastering something that is a 3D action game. Blood Omen 1 and 2, it's 2D, sort of quasi-isometric viewpoint, and not a modern gameplay style as we think of it, but Soul Reaver 1 and 2 not only had the sort of instant fan connection and recognition as the sort of center of that collection of games, they also had the most opportunity to be improved without changing too much. Reyna, whose real name is Monica, by the way, Reyna Audron is her sort of nom de plume in the Cain universe, is also a talented developer. And she was one of the first people that Aspire reached out to work on remastering.
Oh, che figo, hanno lavorato con tutti loro.
Texture pass. And Aspire reached out to her and said, what if we gave you a job?
Bene, grazie mille del follow, benvenuto.
Go do the platonic idealized version of the thing that you've already been tinkering with for years.
So I got this message from X-Program, this Tomb Raider fan, quite known for Open Lara, just if I'd be interested in working on something. And I was like, okay, cool. And then he explained what it was like. Oh my god, why working on Tomb Raider? Like me? It's like I just done a few fan things. Well, why me? But I guess it helped. I did the Tomb Raider 2 HD thing, so I already had some experience. I did my own texture pack, which I slaved away for a year and then published it. So I get really committed when it comes to LOK. So if I want to do something, I'll do it. And no matter what it is, after a year I did release it, so it's out and people can download it and play for free. But I guess, and that was a really good experience because now I get to use it all, right? Yeah, it was really amazing. I just, for 3 days, I was like so happy, like jumping around, like, oh my God, I go to jump in game development. I didn't know how.
So when I heard about the remasters, I was really excited. When I talked to Monica, what I tried to do was just to explain to her the motivations of the way we built things. Like why we built things a certain way, how we got through it, why some things should be respected, why some things could be fudged, helping with some of the original textures that I had still at high res, because all that stuff got pushed down to 64 by 64 at the most. A lot of 32 by 32, a lot of 16 by 16s.
Monica may have secured a job helming the remaster of her favorite game, but this was going to be no easy task. For one, though the games share a common protagonist and storyline, they are separated by a gulf in technology. The original Soul Reaver was released at the end of the PlayStation 1, when many of the console's biggest mysteries had been solved, whereas Soul Reaver 2 was released at the start of the PlayStation 2 era, when developers were designing around an architecture they were yet to fully understand. In fact, the vastly different way that each game handles textures caused a particular challenge for the remastering project 2 decades later. Thankfully, some of the work from her HD
ok, quindi è stato comunque complicato. Vabbè, alla fine c'è sempre qualche complicazione in lavori del genere.
Just stamp it onto an object and it'll translate into the game just fine. Back in the day, you couldn't do that. It just came in as a jumble and you had to slowly rotate each triangle until it matched. And so you would apply a texture and then you'd have to go through the tool and manually turn every polygon. So we actually hired interns at some point because there was so much effort. So it just took that much longer to build an item, to build a room and to proof it.
That's why my HD mod took so long, because I had to cut all these squares, find out how they fit together, build the original picture. I laugh because it's 50 Shades of Grey rock, really.
On top of that, we also increased our memory footprint by being able to reduce the textures down to 4-bit so basically nearly grayscale. We would just basically arc the colors one way or another. Then we use vertex lighting to basically adjust all of the colors.
So I built all these original texture walls back as they were, and then I could replace them. And then you have to cut them back into squares and plug them back in the game. So it was quite a tedious process. But because I already had these original textures,
painted and things like that.
With the second game, the textures are actually really good quality, as I said before. So they're mostly 256s. So we basically, it will not be feasible for me to do both. Soul Reaver 1 needed the extra treatment, but Soul Reaver 2 already looks really good, because Soul Reaver 1 is a PS1 game, and when you switch between the graphics, there's quite a big difference. But Soul Reaver 2, it already looks decent enough for PS2, so when you switch, it's not that much of a, you don't get hit in the face like, wow, this looks so cool. So it's like, oh, this looks nice kind of, thing. So I hope people won't be disappointed. It's like, we had limits, like, Soul Reaver 1 actually looks better in some cases for textures, because the rock wall or floor had like 16 tiles, let's say, but in Soul Reaver 2 it's the same tile, which is 512 by 512 and stretched, and there's no way to fix it because the game works like that. That's how it is. They kind of took some shortcuts with that, so I was like, oh, there's no way to make it less blurry because we are limited by the sizes. The models had they were a lot more complicated in the first place, so obviously even the texture had higher fidelity, so some things like the ground was not as good looking, I guess. But obviously still better than Soul Reaver 1. I mean, I'm only comparing the HD because I could replace the 16 tiles and each tile is 512, so it looks better or sharper in result, but I'm like, oh, I wish I could do something more with Soul Reaver 2 because the grounds like looks a little bit blurry, but there's nothing more we can do to improve it because, you know, it's a remaster. We're bound to the constraints of the original engine, so we can't just, you know, suddenly inflate it. It's gonna have dynamic music. We restored the day and night cycle. We have new HD models, obviously new textures. Don't worry, I didn't just reuse everything I made before. I reworked a lot of it. Restored the dynamic soundtrack was like big one, like you have to have it. It took a while to you know, we have really skilled team members.
Restaurare la dinamica della canzone originale
thanks to that
è una rottura di palle, su questo posso parlare.
The soundtrack in, and it works perfectly. I'm so happy.
Another bonus from the archiving project was the ability to find classic and bonus content that had been lost to time. The PS2 version of Soul Reaver 2 came with a DVD of extras filled with concept art, videos, and behind-the-scenes content that the PC version of the game never had access to. Getting as much of that as they could onto the remaster meant a lot of translation work. But even more interesting for fans of game history is that in that archive Crystal Dynamics had digitized were early builds of the game, and this was definitely content that Reina wanted to include.
We found that I was given access to the archive with all the goodies, and wow, it was 2 terabytes of it, and several folders have actually the complete levels from the game, because obviously the game came out with like 1/3 of the game cut. But we found all these levels, we slot them back in. I even found out like the puzzles, how they kind of work. That you're supposed to flood this giant room and you pull the lever and it actually works. They cut these things, I think it was in March. It was that or not ship the game, so they had to do that hard decision. I'm really glad to see that the players
Giuseppe, grazie mille del follow,
get to play
benvenuto.
these levels. Obviously in just, you know, kind of not fully finished state, but you can actually walk across them and see the architecture and what the plan was, because they all slot together and it's amazing. Like it's like a dream come
Snake,
true.
grazie mille del follow.
Elements,
Ragazzi, il remake penso che tutti l'avremmo voluto, ma la realtà è che ci vuole un budget molto maggiore.
It's amazing. It's like wow.
Però vabbè, hanno fatto comunque un buon lavoro con questi titoli. Ecco mo il futuro. È francamente per uno come me è la cosa che interessa di più in questo momento.
So to me it feels like we're at a real inflection point for the Legacy of Kain franchise.
Esatto.
A couple of weeks ago, Blood Omen 1 and 2 were re-released on modern consoles. There was this Kickstarter for a Soul Reaver prequel graphic novel that reached $1.5 million in funding.
Minchia.
And we are, at time of recording, mere days away from the release of Soul Reaver 1 and 2 Remastered.
This all feels like the type of commercial activity one would pursue if they were trying to make a business case for a new Soul Reaver game, to figure out what is the most important question. After 20 years, is there still an audience for these games?
Esatto,
but the games industry is in a very difficult place
così.
right now when it comes to funding, and Square Enix did sell Kristal Dynamics to Embracer Group in August of 2022, which almost certainly has real implications when it comes to new games being made at the studio.
What's more is the cost of making this specific type of game has only ballooned in the intervening 20 years. You could maybe make a third-person action game with a couple dozen people in the late 90s, but today you're talking hundreds if not thousands of people and tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars of budget. So where are we when it comes to the future of the Soul Reaver franchise? What is it that fans want, and what, if anything, does the studio have planned?
I think if you're making a modern video game of any genre or description, you know, there's a business component that you have to consider. Is there a big enough audience that's interested enough in this to make it worthwhile and revisit? Making games nowadays is much more expensive than it was. That means the risks are higher. It means that the scale of the project and sort of ramping up to build something like that is automatically bigger. With something like Legacy of Kain, you also have that you know, the difficulty of it not being in the public eye for, you know, the better part
sì,
of,
una marea di ricordi,
years,
senza dubbio.
The last time people were actually playing it in a contemporary sense. But weirdly, we've seen this with some research and polling and various other sort of market research activity. The demand is still there for a Kane game. And it has a really positive
Ne abbiamo parlato anche nelle news.
Quite surprisingly large bunch of fans.
Look, I know what people would want. You know, they'd want to see, you know, Kane. They'd want to see gothic horror. I'd want to see the map and blood, lots of blood.
I've went back recently and played Soul Reaver 1 some for things that we've been looking at, and it feels like obviously there are aspects that feel old, but a lot of it held up pretty well, and you could see how it'd be pretty easy to convert it to a more modern game. It feels like there's a lot of games that are sort of similar. There's a lot of, especially the From Software games or like Elden Ring or things like that, feel like it could be, you know, a modern extension of Soul Reaver in a way. So I think it would fit in really well. I think it's something that absolutely you could do, and you know, I would certainly love to see that happen.
I once asked Miyazaki of From Software fame if he would be interested in doing Soul Reaver. I was like, oh, what's your dream project? And I think he said like some sort of D&D sorcery thing or Ultima or something like that. And I was like, hey, actually you should do Soul Reaver because here's why. And I basically presented that to him and he was like, sure, buddy, I don't know what you're talking about, but shit, that's whatever you're talking about for you.
We found in talking to fans,
non
even
sapeva
really
niente,
hardcore
davvero?
fans who are very focused on one aspect or other of the game, when they talk about Legacy of Kain series and Soul Reaver, they are usually talking about the world. They're talking about Nosgoth, they're talking about the characters that inhabited that world, they're talking about specific locations.
No, il prossimo Legacy of Kain o Soul Reaver, Souls-like, spero proprio di no.
Very seldom do we ever have people, you know, regale us with tales of this tricky, weird pixel jump where it was hard to get the camera to look behind you. So what they want to do is clamber up the interior of that castle that they remember fondly and battle, you know, either undead revenants or vampire hunters or whatever they're doing in the story at that moment. But they really are talking about it as if it's a universe rather than a specific gameplay genre. I think the challenge in bringing the story to the modern day is figuring out whether you want to tell a new story or a direct sequel, reimagine the one that's already there. But whatever you do, being authentic to the characters and the philosophy and the stuff that Amy Hennig and the team built back in the day, because that hasn't really dated. But the characters and world invention is perfect and ready to be re-explored in that sense.
If I'm to consider and treat this like remaster that is being headed up by Rainer as being a kind of like putting the toes in the water, I think that's a good move. My ideal would be a full-on remake, a reimagining of Soul Reaver as a starting point. I feel like it doesn't have to be a major open world game. I think that you can take what it is now and build upon it in the same way that Bluepoint did with Demon's Souls remake. Like, I don't know if you go on and create new stories, I definitely would love to see that. But that's something that I think it depends on the success of whatever happens before it.
Hopefully the collection, the remasters, will bring people back on track, make them remember, because many of them didn't play the games for a while, or they can't because they're not available. Some people say we should continue with, you know, what happened after Defiance. Some people think they should remake Soul Reaver 1 or Blood Omen 1. I mean, there's, you know, you can do a lot, but just do it right.
One of the challenges of Soul Reaver was the intricate story. From Blood Omen to Soul Reaver 2, to Defiance, there's a lot of story there. And unless you know those storylines really well, it's like unboxing or untangling a box of wires. And so that can be really challenging in and of itself. But yeah, I would love to see more with the new characters. You know, I'd like to see Kain continue. I'd love to see any of the other brethren explored, or any of the other storylines. Add new characters, create new characters. Raziel wasn't the only one. He came out of nowhere, right? Because there was Blood Omen and then Raziel came out. So I don't think we have to stick with Raziel. He's a great character. Let's make a new character. Let's make other characters that are pretty badass too, and see what they can do and explore that as well.
I think these games are perfect to be reinvestigated
You know, I think this is a world that is incredibly rich and characters that are so well drawn. Infatti, è esattamente la stessa cosa che penso io. Story, it's like you've got the world exists. Nosgoth is there for the taking, but you also have these two characters, Cain and Raziel. They have this cosmic relationship that can be explored at any point, and they've given themselves the greatest thing, which is timelines and time. You've got a playground there. You've got so many gaps of like suggested story that haven't been explored. Such a rich world. You literally have thousands of years of history. It's perfect. Someone do something with this franchise. The fact that you're making this documentary now, the fact that there are going to be so many people speaking so highly of it, shows that there is a voracious desire for this franchise to exist again.
When you
non avrei saputo dirlo meglio.
Tomb Raider just went through this with a very successful launch of the Tomb Raider remastered series. You get a lot of data, and I hate to make it sound dry and boring, but you find out how much energy is out there in the market for something like this. And we knew that they were going to be excited when they find out what we're doing with the remaster. But that also cracked open the question of, when are you going to make a new game? The germination of that seed will likely be energized by the sunlight of just putting it out there again.
It's kind of a miracle when any game gets released, let alone a sequel to a franchise that's been dormant for 2 decades. So who knows if this is just another false start for all those fans who have only gotten older waiting for this rebirth. Or perhaps this is the way it was always meant to happen, a triumphant return right at the moment when it felt like the last flicker of hope was about to be snuffed out. Something darkly poetic. I mean, come on, what could be more Soul Reaver than that?
Okay, send us a kiss.
That's amazing. A kiss?
Yeah.
A Reaver kiss?
A Reaver kiss.
Ok.
Cain is deified. The clans tell tales
bello
of
bello.
him.
Sì, a febbraio uscirà un'altra remaster di Tomb Raider. E secondo me anche per Tomb Raider hanno fatto più o meno la stessa cosa, secondo me. E questa è una cosa piuttosto interessante. È evidente che dentro Crystal Dynamics... Vabbè, allora ragazzi, adesso il documentario è finito. Normalmente passo per tutti quanti i titoli di coda, ma adesso il documentario è stato abbastanza lungo, non voglio perdere troppo tempo voglio parlarvi di un paio di cose, ok? Secondo me è davvero importante. Allora, guardate, la cosa che mi ha fatto più piacere in assoluto di questo documentario è stato ovviamente tutto quanto quello che è tipico di un documentario, ovvero vedere tutte le cose belle. Sì, bellissima la intro di Soul Reaver, a proposito. Vedete tutte le cose belle che hanno scoperto, quindi riesplorare la storia, tutto quello che è successo, bellissimo quanto ti pare. Ma io credo che la maggior parte delle persone al giorno d'oggi sia interessata a il futuro, ok? Benissimo, sono contento che ci siano le remastered, ma è assolutamente evidente che le remastered ci sono e sono state prese in considerazione in funzione del futuro. E come tutti noi sospettavamo, abbiamo avuto la conferma da questo documentario direttamente da loro, dallo studio. Sanno tutto quello che avevamo immaginato. Loro lo stanno dicendo apertamente, lo sanno già, hanno capito che c'è interesse per questo franchise e la remastered serve come banco di prova per vedere se banalmente soldini arrivano da questo franchise, se butti fuori qualcosa di interessante, no? E sono molto curioso di vedere quanto ha venduto questa remastered, perché potrebbe aver venduto abbastanza bene, e se ha venduto sufficientemente bene magari riescono a tirare fuori i fondi necessari per fare un seguito vero e proprio. Ora, attenzione, sarà un remake? Sarà un seguito diretto? Sarà un nuovo gioco che però è un reboot, no? E quindi si riprende fin dal primissimo Blood Omen, no? È difficile dire che cosa faranno. Non so dirvi se lo faranno, però è interessante sapere che la cosa sembra essere positiva. Il documentario è bellissimo, sì, un sacco di cuore in questo documentario, mi è piaciuto un sacco, e magari anche cose come questo documentario aiutano. Mi fa piacere vedere queste cose anche per spingere un po' di persone a parlarne, e quindi parlandone aumenta la consapevolezza, aumenta la quantità di discorso online. Banalmente vuol dire che aumenteranno anche un po' le copie vendute della remastered che è uscita da poco, e questo potrebbe portare quindi nuova linfa al fuoco che porterà poi a eventualmente vedere un nuovo titolo. Bene. Tutto questo mi piace soltanto. La grossa sorpresa è stata vedere dai discorsi, soprattutto dell'ultimo pezzo del documentario, che è esattamente quello che abbiamo pensato tutti, e sanno tutto, sanno già esattamente che cosa si potrebbe fare. Il punto quindi credo sia semplicemente vedere se ci sono le condizioni per farlo. E sì, a detta giusta, lui l'ha spiegata benissimo. Al giorno d'oggi un nuovo titolo AAA, no? O comunque ad alto standard, costa un sacco di soldi, ci vuole un sacco di tempo ed è un grande rischio. Quindi questo banco di prova era importante, è importante tuttora, vediamo come va. Bene ragazzi, molto contento di questo documentario, sono molto contento del fatto che le cose a quanto pare siano, diciamo, una buona prospettiva. Vediamo se continua davvero così.